As you can see, it's just past midnight and I've just returned home from a long day's work, and whilst having a late dinner I started reading in the online news portals about how a medical doctor had administered the wrong dosage of the COVID vaccine to two elderly aged care patients or aged care residents in Queensland, and has since been stood down from administering more vaccines and is being reported to the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Authority for further investigation. I'm also watching with interest as to how different news outlets are reporting it. Some tend to focus more on the doctor actually making the error and how that doctor may or may not have completed his mandatory training on how to administer the COVID vaccine. Others do focus on how his error got picked up by the nurse, which thankfully avoided more patients being administered with the wrong dosage. I can't imagine the public outcry about this incident, see how potentially the two residents could have been harmed. Thankfully they're being monitored at the moment, and so far as I speak there's been no no side effects really experienced by these two residents. But I guess I felt compelled to document my own reflections on this matter. Look, it's of course, before I continue, I should mention that this is just purely my view and not representative of my employer's view. It's just my own, in my own capacity as a doctor. And again, I should also qualify that it's really not my place to comment on whether or not the public should feel outraged that the doctor made such an error, or whether or not this doctor should have been suspended or not suspended from his duties or reported to the Health Practitioner Authority. The focus of my reflection is really on what a doctor actually feels when these sort of things happen. In my role, I can pretty confidently say that lots of my colleagues and doctors, we've all got skeletons in our closet. You know, we've all made some form of mistake in our practice, some minor, some really major, and ultimately that's because we're all human. We are just as prone as you are to making a slip, a brain lapse, and of course throughout our whole medical career we get trained to be extra careful, extra vigilant. We get trained to believe that we should never make mistakes, mainly because one mistake could actually kill someone, and that's definitely not why we went into medicine. We wanted to heal people and not kill people. But I guess the way in which we're trained actually makes us really vulnerable to getting shattered whenever a mistake occurs. There's a famous quote called "To err is human." It was actually an article published by someone, I think back in the 1980s, highlighting the fact that, look, human error is bound to happen, but what we do need to do is to design systems that are redundant, in a sense, that are able to pick up these errors and prevent the errors from causing harm in patients. In fact, a lot of my work day to day actually involves improving the systems of health services so that those errors don't lead to patient harm. But coming back to the doctor's sentiment, one of the main questions I ask when I interview applicants to doctor roles in my health service is, what can you share an error that you've made, and what your learning was and what the outcome was. And I intentionally asked that question because I wanted to signal to say that whilst we know and we are trained that we should never make errors are unavoidable. An important part is that we should be open about them and learn from them so that we don't do it again next time. And it's fascinating hearing some of the responses from medical staff. A lot of them actually do try to answer in a way that suggests that they haven't actually made an error. I suspect they would have made bigger errors than that. I've made a big error. I've missed a diagnosis, and it kind of still weighs on my mind. Thankfully the patient's okay. But we're so susceptible to the public opinion if these errors were portrayed wrongly. The error that was made by the doctor, a medication error, it's actually much more common in healthcare than the public thinks. Of course, errors do not necessarily lead to harm, and I guess that's the point I wanted to stress. And I'd be really surprised if there are colleagues of mine who haven't either personally made an accidental medication related error or seen an error done by a colleague. But again, it's the public persecution that sort of makes us really scared of admitting our errors, and what's just played out in the media is certainly reinforcing that. That the doctor that has been suspended could have been any one of us. He was just the unfortunate person that received so much media attention at that time. I feel for him because that could be his career gone, and despite all the good things that one does as a doctor, that single moment of error could be life-changing. It could be devastating. Whether after investigation, it was avoidable or not avoidable, etc. The fact that it's already played out in the media can have devastating consequences. So really, that's just my reflection. There's another incident that occurred early on during the COVID pandemic in 2020, where a GP in Melbourne was singled out because he had continued to see patients despite having symptoms or sort of respiratory symptoms, and ended up being diagnosed as COVID positive and was singled out in the media and received unnecessary and unwanted attention. And despite the fact that eventually this doctor was found to have done the right thing in terms of calling the COVID hotline, etc., he still got the unnecessary media attention, and I can't imagine how he would have felt at that time. So there you go. That's just a bit of insight as to how doctors think, and how myself as a doctor feels, and what how fragile we are as a medical community. Hopefully, if you're someone who's not from the medical community watching this, you'll develop a bit more insight and understanding as to how vulnerable doctors can be, and perhaps pause and try to think about the situation from the doctor's perspective the next time you see news about a doctor committing a grave error playing out in the media. Of course, I'm not here to defend doctors, and of course there are some doctors that are blatantly wrong, but I'm just talking about the majority of the doctors who always go to work trying to do the right thing, who may at some stage in their career experience this sort of media blowout event. Well, thanks for listening and thanks for watching, and have a great night. See you later.